today's World Insight. The European Union in an energy crunch after Russia suspends Nord Stream gas supplies. Could Western Europe cope? Gas prices through the roof?
Both economically and politically, this is something very new and, of course, very dangerous, and it will almost certainly get worse.
This is our host, Tian Wei.
Hello and welcome to World Insight. I'm Tian Wei. Russia has suspended indefinitely the gas supplies through the Nord Stream pipeline to Germany, citing an oil leak in the turbine. It coincided with a group of 7 finance ministers announcing a price cap on Russian oil. It sparked European concerns over energy prices and growth. How can Europe cope? And what is really behind these geopolitical struggle on energy crisis? Let's loop in our panelists. For the latest related to Russia cutting off gas exports to Europe in Warsaw, Richard Sakwa, who is a professor of Russian and European politics with University of Kent. In Moscow, Mark Sloboda, international relations and security analyst. In Shanghai, Zhao Long, professor from the Center for Russian and Central Asian Studies with Shanghai Institute for International Studies. In Beijing, Kenvin Tu, managing director of Agora Energy Transition, China. Gentlemen, welcome to the program. Well, everybody has been focusing their attention on what is going on in Europe, what's likely to future supply of the European energy. Mr. Tu, many wonder what is likely to be the future of energy supply for Europe. You've been doing research in that regard. Tell me more about your thoughts.
Currently, both sides are in a lose situation because in the short term, with the complete shutdown of Nord Stream 1, it's very difficult for Europe, especially Germany, to go through the winter heating season without any trouble. However, if we look at what's going on now, because of the ongoing energy security challenges, the European countries, especially EU member countries, are doubling down their efforts on clean energy transition, trying to ramp up the installation of renewable energy storage and green hydrogen facilities. So in the longer term, this will be good for European country to be energy self-reliant.
Mr. Sakwa, you are based in Warsaw. Tell me more your assessment of the latest situation for this winter, for example, and the longer term.
In the immediate term, Europe is looking for alternative sources of energy. We know that they've gone to the Gulf states and across the world. The difficulty is that the shortage of energy in the short term means 2 things. First, greater reliance on dirty energy. Imports of coal have gone up significantly. So the green energy transition, the attempts to deal with the ecological environmental crisis have been set back quite significantly. Second, the search for alternatives is difficult because there aren't many alternatives, certainly not in the short term. The LNG, liquid natural gas, exports from the United States are harmed by the shutdown of the major exporting facility in Texas. And there just simply isn't enough gas about because even though a lot of people say that LNG is effectively a spot market where you can just be very flexible, in fact, most Asian markets are based on long-term contracts. So there's a little bit of flexibility, but not much. In other words, Europe is facing one of the most challenging winters in terms of energy since the Second World War, or certainly just after the war.
I understand that there are a lot of debates going on inside the European economies about this. Some even worry about whether they have enough heating during the winter time. Others were even joking whether their phones will still being able to be charged, whether they can use their home phones, fixed lines, whether the satellites will work. A lot of these questions already in the daily debates and discussions you see in the media. So, Mr. Sakwa, do you see the situation as severe as that?
Oh, yes, possibly even worse, because the response is going to be possibly civil disorder. In the United Kingdom, in England, there is already the cost of living crisis is again something which we have not come across. You know, it's unprecedented what's going on. And of course, there's a whole political argument, backlash, which is going to be provoked by this, by the people going to say, look, you've messed up. You've cut energy supplies from Russia, which has been a long-term, reliable source of energy. You've undercut the branch on which we're sitting, and we, the people, are suffering. Already it's a question of eating or heating.
Mr. Tu, at the same time, we are seeing two different things happening. Fossil fuels and also gas prices heating up around the world. At the same time, we also see that there are political demonstrations in some of the European capitals already about what Europe are doing to Ukraine, for example, and what they are providing to their own citizens. What do you make of these latest developments? Seem to be some kinds of political turmoil.
Of course, if we look at high energy price, given the implications for the living standards of average Europeans, then there will be difficulties for European government trying to balance what should be their political and military stance against Russia, and how should they help the average citizen to reduce their living costs, especially against the backdrop of the forthcoming winter heating season. This is not an easy job to be managed by the European politicians in the coming months. But anyhow, I do believe in the end, both the European citizen and also the European government need to find a fine balance regarding what should be their top political priority and how to maintain political stability, but also ensure economic sustainability of the European economies.
What is the strategic calculation and thinking about the latest decision about Nord Stream 1? And also, how do you see there is any space and maneuvering place for both sides to negotiate or to discuss?
Yeah, from Russia, right now, we're hearing the outrage, the whining that Russia is weaponizing energy against Europe. Please, the European Union, the West as a whole, declared an existential economic war against Russia. They weaponized their entire economies and their control of the global financial and economic infrastructure in their attempt to cut Russia completely off from global markets and to make the Russian people suffer so much that they would rise up in the streets and overthrow their own governments. Now, Russia is going through some technical justifications for the throttling, now the shutting off of gas completely to Nord Stream 1. I mean, I think it's pretty clear that this is Russia's asymmetric response. They are weaponizing their economy in turn against Europe.
Do you think there's any space for maneuver as an observer?
No, and in fact, things are going to get worse. In the short term, we've already seen the imposition or attempt to impose a price cap on oil. And just yesterday, the European Union was talking about a price cap on gas, which seems to be some sort of living in la-la land, because given the shortages at the moment, and I mean, there's a global shortages, of course, and price rises, the attempt to impose it. And of course, Russia is always responding, as Mark just said. This is a dynamic situation in which we are engaging in an economic warfare. Again, it's unprecedented. According to Russian estimates, 10,000 sanctions have been imposed on Russia since the early part of this year. We've never seen anything like this before in the world. And therefore, I certainly argue, and it's absolutely right, we must find a pathway to negotiation. And the European Union, we would have expected as a acclaimed peace project to be one of the leaders in multilateral negotiations. Instead, it's one of the leaders in intensifying economic warfare. So again, both economically and politically, this is something very new and, of course, very dangerous, and it will almost certainly get worse.
Mr. Zhao, you are an observer from China about Russia and also the European countries. Tell me more about your assessment.
I think there's a very little room for any kind of negotiation or compromise because in addition of the cut off natural gas supply, Russia had already threatened to retaliate by banning oil exports to countries that implement so-called price cap, which the consensus made by G7 countries. And also high officials of Russia also warned that if EU implements price cap, Russia will no longer supply natural gas to Europe. Of course, behind this kind of conflict, there's always a political agenda. But I think for Russia, is trying to use energy as the countermeasure towards the sanctions. And for EU, they're trying to show their solidarity, coherence with the US, with other world, so-called, again, to support Ukraine. But from this point of view, I think both sides simply cannot bear the consequences of stepping back or retreating its position in this ultimate contest. Neither can afford any kind of a compromise. So there will be still room for further escalation of this kind of energy conflict, in my opinion.
We see the OPEC is having its meeting this week. We also see the prices of both natural gas and the fossil fuel, the oil, rising up quite sharply in the international market. We also see the depreciation of the euro in face of these dangers. So there seems to be a lot of information to digest, Mr. Tu. It's not just related to energy, it's also related to the prospect of European economies in the future, how eventually this big geopolitical crisis is likely to be resolved, Mr. Tu, with the economic backdrop.
Indeed, the situation is pretty serious for European country to deal with. If we look at what happened last year, we have already witnessed energy market shock across the globe in different parts of the world. For instance, very high gas price in EU countries and also power crunch in certain parts of China. However, if you look at what happened after the outbreak of Russia-Ukraine war in this February, then this energy market shock has already become an energy crisis. If we look at the history of energy crisis, especially the first two oil crises back in 1973 and then 1979, each energy crisis turned out to become the precursor of economic recession of the world economy. So let's wait and see which economy will first be hit by the ongoing energy crisis.
The world is changing fast, taking all our lives with it. But we can change it too, by seeking answers to problems through discussions and debates. On World Insight, I ask direct questions to real people in the know, seek genuine answers, but respect diverse perspectives. Our live global debates tackle the most critical issues head-on. World Insight with Tian Wei go beyond the headlines.
Images may appear to be identical, but looks can be deceiving. The difference is not always obvious. It has to be discovered. There are always different sides to a story. We put the focus on the details. To see more, to understand better. CGTN. See the difference.
Professor, how do you see the Europeans as a whole will be able to come to some kinds of consensus? Do you see any signs of it right now?
One of the important factors in all of this is the asymmetric issue of energy crisis in the political West itself, the so-called collective West, because the United States, in these terms, is actually doing quite well in the energy front because it cannot export it as much as LNG as it wanted to because of the closing of that Texas plant. It's actually awash with gas domestically, and the price has come down. Whereas, of course, so they could go on for a long time, whereas it's the poor Europeans. And so the Americans are fighting this war not just to the last Ukrainian, but to the last European. So they can go on. And so the problem is at the moment is, and then, I don't want to be excessively one-sided, but, the basic argument is clear that in some ways this crisis has shown the subaltern, the weakness of the position of the European Union within the collective West. And in fact, it subordinated its own energy future, its even political future, to a struggle which in effect is part of a larger, Washington-Moscow relationship, which we're not going to talk about now. But it does show its weak or subordinate position. An absolutely astonishing act of economic suicide, if you like, with huge political consequences. There's elections coming up in Italy, other countries, and it'll be interesting to see how those play out.
Mr. Zhao?
Well, I think there will be a much, or you can call it unprecedented challenges towards the European economy. According to some think tank studies, if Russia stops supplying natural gas to the Europe, the Eurozone countries will run out of reserves by the end of this year. So, and Italy or Germany could have the almost up to the 3% drop of their GDP. So there will be a much worse scenario for the Central Eastern countries. For example, the Hungary, Slovak Republic, Czech Republic, and others. So that's why we're seeing the protesters, the demonstrations. The people went on the street to protest the government's position on the Russian energy in Czech Republic. I think there will be much more challenges for those countries to dealing with Russia in terms of energy conflict. And also, I think if we will see the further escalation of such conflict, there will be further divided within the Europe. For example, some countries has already started to negotiate with Russia on the energy supply alone without EU's coordination, just like Hungary and others. So I think there will be a huge challenge for EU to show their solidarity on energy policies and also on the Ukraine issue.
With these sanctions coming from the Western economies and now more, shall I say, self-initiated actions regarding export of energy, what would that mean for the Russian economy, Mr. Sloboda?
Okay, well, all of the recent assessments of the state of the Russian economy under sanctions coming from the UN bodies, coming from the Russian government, coming even from the pages of The Economist, are that the Russian economy seems well positioned to continue moving forward. Unemployment is low, dramatically low. The ruble is strong. There are no overall weak indicators. Even manufacturing and industry are up. Grain sales are through the roof, of course. And quite frankly, there are very little signs on the streets of Moscow that there is an economic crisis or even a war taking place.
Well, it sounds like you're really confident about where Russia is. I understand your stance pretty well. But on the other hand, how sustainable can Russia be like this in the longer term, let's just say beyond this year?
Well, with the ever increasing energy sales to China, to India, even to Saudi Arabia, which is buying Russian oil, using it for their own domestic needs, and then selling their own oil at even higher prices to Western markets, it looks sustainable for the long term.
Well, I think we should acknowledge that that kind of energy conflict or war is always should be considered as a double-edged sword, because it will, of course, will hurt the European economy. But I think for Russia, this kind of total cutoff of natural gas supply will damage, maybe in some extent, to some extent, its role as a reliable energy supplier at the global level. So I think Russia inevitably has to consider the significance of the energy exports as the lifeblood of its economy and its own role in the global market. So I think that's why this kind of a conflict still there's room for the further escalation, but there will be a very clear boundary or a limitation for Russia, for Russia's countermeasures to be taken in the future. And maybe in the future, Russia will concentrate on to increase the frequency of those technical issues and cutoffs to causing Europe to panic in anticipation of the stable energy supply. But Russia at the same time will increase their supply to other markets like to Asia Pacific, and so on.
When other major economies, especially China, look at their long-term relations with Russia on energy trade, they will think about whether it's reliable to rely on Russian energy imports, especially if Russia becomes the largest foreign supplier of oil, gas, and coal. So this will have quite a significant implication for Russian energy trade in the longer term.
I find this conversation about credibility, frankly, ridiculous. No one is talking about the reliability of the West as a governor of the global financial economic system, that they can't weaponize their control of global markets, SWIFT, attempting to dictate energy prices. Are they a reliable economic partner? It was the West that initiated this. Russia is responding. Certainly, China, India, the other countries do not seem to have a problem with the question of reliability of Russian energy supplies, because they are increasing month by month, and there seems to be no end in sight to their thirst for Russian energy that they can get at a comparative discount right now because global prices have been risen so high. It is the West's role, their credibility as reliable economic partners and governors of global economic systems that needs to be called into question.
How do you see these international platforms likely to see with their own lens the energy crisis going on and what is going on between Europe and Russia? Mr. Zhao.
Well, I think there are very limited options for international community to, to ease that kind of conflict, because unlike the oil market, the global natural gas market does not have a unified cartel organization like OPEC to coordinate market resources. And I think currently we are witnessing the sanctions and the countermeasures between Russia and the Western countries, which based on their own decision. So it's very, I think, very challenging for other countries or any kind of international mechanism to coordinate their policies on the natural gas or oil. And I think for other countries, the only thing we can do is maybe to call on both parties to exercise some restraint and reduce their collateral damage to international energy market.
So after the oil crisis in 1973, the International Energy Agency was established as the Western countries' countermeasure against OPEC. So back then, in 1970s, that period probably was an effective period for international energy governance. But if we look at what happened thereafter, because of the drastic shift of center of gravity of global energy consumption from Western country to China, India, and other emerging economies, the international energy governance system has already been fragmented. So this is one reason why it's not very effective to deal with the current crisis. Another reason is just as was mentioned by Mr. Zhao, in the natural gas market, there is no effective international organization to govern how the market may function. In addition, from a physical perspective, because lots of gas trading is through pipeline instead of LNG, basically you have a fixed supplier country and a fixed consuming country. It's extremely difficult to re-export pipeline gas from Russia to EU countries unless you spend lots of time to build another pipeline to link the supplier and consumers.
Hard to find alternative in the short term. Okay, got it. Kevin Tu, Zhao Long, Mark Sloboda, Richard Sagwa, thank you so much, gentlemen, for joining us. My earlier discussion on energy supplies in Europe. That's all the time we have for today. If you'd like to know more, you can search World Insight or check out our YouTube channel. Follow us on Twitter and Facebook. I'm Tian Wei. On behalf of the team, thanks for being with us. Bye.